my name is First Lieutenant Elizabeth Guidara, and today I will be discussing the conflict between Russia and Chechnya. Here's an overview of what we're going to cover. First, the purpose of the simulation, as well as the importance of the topic, a discussion of relevant readings that address the topic, a discussion of critical factors that contribute to successful conflict resolution, as well as general conclusions about the topic and a summation of the simulation experience. Alright, the purpose of the simulation is twofold. First, we need to examine the conflict between Russia and Chechnya from a variety of perspectives in order to gain a better understanding of how the conflict came about, how it evolved, and what strategies can be implemented. So, by exploring the viewpoints of radical Chechen rebels, as well as Russian government officials and human rights activists, we were able to gain a better understanding of the conflict. And additionally, the purpose of the simulation was to explore how Track 1 and Track 2 diplomacy can be used in conjunction with one another in order to achieve effective conflict resolution. So while Track 1 diplomacy is important for the institutionalization of peace by facilitating official dialogue between governments, Track 2 diplomacy is important in terms of facilitating unofficial dialogue, so workshops, grassroots organizations, that sort of thing. Alright, the topic is important for two reasons. So first, it sheds light on the need to analyze conflicts within their respective historical contexts. As humans, we tend to subconsciously be tempted to point fingers on who to blame, as opposed to analyzing the conflict more in depth and how these relationships between opposing parties evolved over time. So with that being said, it revealed the danger of relying on specific episodes within a conflict as opposed to analyzing how that episode fit in with a larger holistic comprehensive picture of the conflict itself in history. Alright, so relevant readings include chapters from Ramsbotham, which includes Paul Ware's conflict map, Galtung's conflict triangle, Azar's theory of protracted social conflict, Reza Najafbadi's article on how the failure to communicate can lead to conflict, as well as the Routledge Handbook of Ethnic Conflict on how ethnicity and religion should be viewed as social constructs when analyzing conflicts. Alright, so first we'll delve into Paul Ware's conflict map, which essentially provides a useful snapshot of a conflict and how it evolved. So, short summary description of the conflict between Russia and Chechnya. So, Russia and Chechnya have been entrenched in a deeply rooted conflict for over 150 years. The basic issue is this: Chechnya has wanted independence and autonomy from Russia, and Russia has strongly denied this, which has resulted in violence and coercion. The conflict history is as follows. So, it all began when Russia began moving some of its troops into Chechnya in the 1830s. This later escalated to the extent of Stalin actually expelling Chechens from the then Soviet Union during World War II into surrounding nations. And they actually weren't even allowed back into their own country until 12 years after the World War II had ended. And once they were accepted back into Chechnya, they had to undergo a Russification program, which was essentially imposing Russian culture on the Chechens. So clearly there's a lot of reasons why the Chechens resented the Russians. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and became the Russian Federation, the Chechens saw this as a prime opportunity to claim independence and to fight for autonomy. So the newly elected President Guidara claimed independence from Russia, and in response to this, Yeltsin moved a bunch of his troops into Chechnya to crush the rebellion in 1994. Over 100,000 Chechens were killed as a result of this. Dudayev was then killed in 1996. So what happened from there, there were a series of peace talks, as well as an official ceasefire negotiation between the a Chechen official, Aslan Maskadov, and a Russian general, Alexander Lebedin, which was formed in the late 1990s. I believe it was 1996, 97, somewhere along that line. Anyways, so that ceasefire was then commenced, and in 1997, Maskhadov officially became the president of Chechnya, and Yeltsin actually recognized him. But what signified the transition from the end of the Chechen War, the first Chechen War, to the movement to the second one, is that a bunch of rebel factions within Chechnya emerged and essentially challenged the authority of Maskhadov. They claimed that Sharia law should be the new governing force within Chechnya and that Maskhadov should resign. So Russian forces actually did withdraw their troops officially from Chechnya after the First Chechen War, but the problem was that a lot of violence and kidnapping within Chechnya occurred after this. Chechnya was severely ravaged after the war and was suffering a lot of crime and poverty. So in 1999, Shamil Basiev, who was a Chechen rebel forces warlord, actually moved a bunch of his troops into the neighboring Republic of Dagestan and claimed his intent to fuse Chechnya and Dagestan into a single Islamic republic. So Putin, who is the newly elected Prime Minister of Russia at the time, was extremely alarmed by this, and in 2000 he moved a bunch of Russian troops into Chechnya to recapture Grozny and to reestablish a pro-Russian Chechen administration within Chechnya. So the Chechens were not happy about this, and as a result of this, they retaliated. They even took 800 people hostage in a crowded Moscow theater in exchange for autonomy, and the Russians pumped a gas agent into the theater and killed 150 people. The Chechens also conducted a bombing of the government headquarters in Grozny, which really angered Putin. So clearly, the Chechens are still fighting for the autonomy and independence, and Putin saw them as just a bunch of lawless terrorists resorting to the use of violence, and was not so keen on granting them independence. Alright, so that's the conflict history, conflict context. Why has Russia been so opposed to granting autonomy to Chechnya? So the basic reason is this. Chechnya is rich in a lot of oil and natural resources, and Russia is heavily dependent on oil exports. Also, Russia sees Chechnya as a security threat. If Chechnya gained independence from Russia, that would cause major fragmentation within the Russian Federation. So the conflict parties are obviously the Chechen rebels as well as the Russian Federation. The issues, we already covered that. That would be the issue of autonomy that Chechnya is fighting so hard for. Conflict dynamics. So the global order plays a role in how the conflict has evolved. So Bush's global war on terror has affected this, and Putin is very clever in how he pointed fingers at people. So essentially, he accused the Chechens of being associated with the Al-Qaeda without any sort of evidence, and in response to this, the U.S. hopped on board in terms of supporting the Russian Federation because, we've embarked on the whole global war on terror. So because of that, they've become anti-Chechen and pro-Russian in this case. Alternative routes to a solution. So as we discussed before, track 2 diplomacy is important in facilitating dialogue. Track 3 diplomacy, which will be discussed a little bit later, is also important in terms of capacity building within a ravaged nation such as Chechnya. Cyber peacemaking and increasing the role of the media within Chechnya is another possible route in terms of revealing those human rights violations and atrocities that have been committed in order to facilitate reconciliation between the Chechens and the Russians. Clearly there is resolution potential, as with any conflict, but it's going to be long, hard, and difficult. First off, they need to be able to peacefully negotiate and speak with one another and be able to move on from past hatreds and fears. Alright, Galtung's conflict triangle. So Galtung essentially theorized that there are 3 vertices of this triangle: contradiction, conflict attitude, as well as conflict behavior. So the contradiction is simply the incompatibility of goals between conflict parties. So as mentioned over and over, the incompatible goal in this case is the issue of Chechnya's autonomy. Chechnya wants it, Russia does not. In terms of their attitude towards one another, they both have very negative attitudes towards one another. Chechnya views Russians as autocratic and oppressive, and Russians view Chechens as lawless and essentially corrupt. And finally, behavior can involve cooperation or coercion. Unfortunately, behavior between these two parties has more so involved violence against one another in order to achieve their wants and needs. Alright, Azar's theory of protracted social conflict sheds light on Chechnya's constant fight for autonomy. So, within this theory, the big takeaway is that conflict erupts when basic human needs are not being met, which include security needs, development needs, identity needs, and political access needs. So the two biggest ones to highlight for Chechnya are development needs as well as political access needs. So as stated previously, in the First Chechen War, Chechnya was ravaged. It was absolutely destroyed. And the Russians did very little to help rebuild their society. So they want that increased capacity of institutions. They also want increased political access. Currently, there's a pro-Russian government in Chechnya. They want to be independent from Russia. So those needs aren't being met, which is why they are resorting to violence. Alright, and finally, another dynamic in this conflict is simply the failure to communicate. Communication can become distorted when crossing cultural lines. And because of that, mutual trust, respect, and empathy between adversaries is crucial to conflict resolution. Alright, and there's also a danger in relying on the social constructs of ethnicity and religion in terms of explaining conflict. So often we say, the conflict in Rwanda was simply because of ethnicity. Well, yes, that was a component of it, but it's more complicated than that. So for instance, in Chechnya, they were clever that they mobilized their resources and their communities to fight for the cause of autonomy and independence. So Islam became a big player in this in terms of mobilizing people around this common cause of autonomy and religion, and it took on this radical role, essentially. Alright, and finally, critical factors that contribute to successful conflict resolution. So first off, we need to effectively reframe the conflict. Third parties need to be able to help reframe the relationship between top dogs and underdogs. They need to be able to communicate with one another effectively in asymmetric conflicts like between Chechnya and Russia. Next, effective and appropriate implementation of Track 1, Track 2, and Track 3 diplomacy. So, as stated before, official diplomatic relations between governments is very important, but Track 2 and Track 3 diplomacy are key to rebuilding societies, to facilitating that dialogue so that true peace building and reconciliation can be achieved. So these need to be used in conjunction with one another and coordinated between agencies as opposed to doing it in a piecemeal fashion. Post-war reconstruction is obviously important. Chechnya's situation is a clear example of this. So reestablishing the rule of law, getting rid of a culture of impunity, these are all key to rebuilding society after extreme violence. Reconciliation is also key between parties. So recognizing the fact that atrocities were committed and moving forward from then on. And finally, peace building is key to restabilizing a nation. So that could be anywhere from socioeconomic peace building to security. According to a particular scholar, we need to pick and choose from the, quote, peace building palette and tailor it to the specific situation. So to sum up, an uncoordinated piecemeal approach to conflict resolution is not the way to go. Major issues need to be addressed head-on as opposed to letting them fester, which was the case after the First Chechen War. The question of autonomy wasn't even addressed after the war had ended. And perspectives of the underdogs need to be taken into account. So the role I chose during the simulation as the Chechen Rebel Forces Field Commander, Emin Orta, shed a lot of light on where I came to better understand where the Chechen rebels were coming from and why they felt the way they did, as opposed to just, blatantly slapping on the label of terrorist on the Chechens. It's important to take the viewpoints of all parties involved into a conflict and try to come to the best possible outcome through Track 1, 2, 3, and 3 diplomacy, through reconciliation, through peace building. these all need to be used in unison with one another. Thank you, and this concludes my presentation.